I am Daniel Keys,
And this is Mick, the Doctor of Digital.
and welcome to Music 101. Music 101 is created to empower music itself and legendary icon in the music industry. Another week, another great episode on Music 101. How are you, Mr. Mac?
I am counting my blessings, as we always say. It's fantastic. Feeling good today.
Count your blessing, people. Stop complaining. And we are so grateful that we have a greatest rock band of all times record so many cover versions. Don't you think, Mr. Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. This is ironic, is it not? So, I'm going to introduce the cover versions recorded by the greatest rock band of all time. And who could possibly be but the Beatles? So, Lennon and McCartney, greatest songwriters ever. But they also recorded a lot of cover versions, especially in the very beginning of their career and at the very end. So, it's ironic. But an important question to ask about the Beatles is why the greatest rock band and the most iconic and influential songwriting team in history would record cover versions of songs. So I've been thinking about great cover versions, but it makes sense to begin with the best band of all time and examine their discography. So I can provide some context and statistics to support their impressive legacy. According to the Recording Industry Association of America, Lennon and McCartney have written or co written 178 songs that have been certified gold or platinum, including 17 number one hits. The Beatles' music has sold over a billion records worldwide, making them one of the best selling music artists of all time. Lennon and McCartney have won numerous awards, including multiple Grammy Awards, Academy Awards, and inductions into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Their songs have been covered by countless artists and have become standards in their own right. Some notable statistics that demonstrate their impact on popular music include, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, Lennon and McCartney have written or co written 21 songs that have reached the top 10 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. The Beatles have had 20 number one hits on the Billboard Hot 100 chart, with many of these songs written or co written by Lennon and McCartney. Lennon and McCartney have been credited with writing or co writing 17 songs that have been inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. Lennon and McCartney's impressive track record, enduring popularity, and influence on popular music make a strong case for their status as one of the most successful, if not the most successful, and iconic songwriting teams in history. A comprehensive account of the songs that the Beatles loved enough to cover themselves and oftentimes make their own are worth considering. Some of these covers were hits for the band as well and were top 10 hits. Roll Over Beethoven by Chuck Berry. This song was a top 10 hit for the Beatles in 1963, reaching number 3 on the UK singles chart. Twist and Shout by the Top Notes. This song was a top 10 hit for the Beatles in 63, reaching number 2 on the UK singles chart. Some Other Guy by Richie Barrett. This song was a top 10 hit for the Beatles in 63, reaching number 1 on the UK singles chart. In conclusion, Paul McGuinness of You Discover Music has done a yeoman's work on this topic, and I'm indebted to his first rate work. I retain original graphics from his work if you want to see this online as well. So here's a question: what covers did the Beatles record? Between 1963 and 1970, the Beatles catalog included 25 cover versions. The vast majority included on their albums or EPs up to 1965. But over the last 30 years, many more have come to light. And talk about every cover version recorded and released by the Beatles. Many of the songs the Beatles heard were similar R&B or rock and roll staples to those tackled by most of their contemporaries. In fact, I always like to throw in a personal side here as well. My favorite songwriter, Ian Hunter, put his time in Germany as the Beatles did and wrote a song entitled Bed of Roses. And it's also got that drummer, who everybody knows, Ringo Starr, on drums about his experience.
Ringo
So
Starr.
during the 1960s, what happened is that a lot of British musicians began to frequent Germany for work. The country's thriving music scene, combined with its proximity to the UK, made it an attractive destination for British bands looking to tour, record, and perform. The Beatles, in particular, had a strong connection to Germany, having played numerous shows in Hamburg, Germany, and other cities throughout the decade. The band's early years were marked by grueling tours and recording sessions in Germany, where they honed their craft and developed their signature sound. The Beatles' experiences in Germany had a profound impact on their music, including the development of the unique blend of pop folk, and rock styles. But one of the things that set the Beatles apart was their breadth of taste and repertoire. Quote, a lot of our tracks may not have been cool, Paul McCartney later explained. I think if we'd just been cool, we wouldn't have made it how we did, but this was a great aspect of us. The BBC recorded the Beatles on several occasions before they became famous as part of their regular programming and music shows. The BBC was a major broadcaster in the UK and had a long history of showcasing new and emerging talent. In the early 1960s, the BBC was looking to promote new music and artists, and they saw the Beatles as a promising young band with a unique sound. They invited the band to perform on several of their popular music shows, including Top of the Pops program, which would weekly showcase for the latest hits. The BBC also recorded the Beatles for their Saturday Club program, which was a popular music show that featured live performances by up and coming artists. The band performed on the show several times. The BBC's decision to record the Beatles before they became famous was likely due to a combination of factors, including their growing popularity in Liverpool and Hamburg, as well as their band's unique sound and style. The BBC was always on the lookout for new and exciting talent, and they saw the Beatles as a band with a lot of potential. I guess they were right about that. It's worth noting that the BBC's recording of the Beatles were not just limited to the early days. The band continued to perform on BBC programs throughout their career, and many of these recordings have been released over the years. After the initial 25 songs released during their lifetime, a great number of those listed were also recorded live in session for the BBC and feature on 2 volumes of archived BBC releases. The remainder were unearthed for their anthology project in 1994 or for the 50th anniversary deluxe editions of their later period albums. In conclusion, fortunately for us, the BBC recorded and saved many of the earliest Beatles songs. So, would you like to know what some of those are?
Certainly, Mr. Mike. What
All
a
right.
day.
What a day. So, Anna, Go to Him. Arthur Alexander is one of a handful of artists covered by both the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, the latter doing You Better Move On. As Paul told Beatles historian Mark Levison in 1987, if the Beatles ever wanted a sound, it was R&B. That's what we used to listen to, and that's what we like to be like. That was basically it. Arthur Alexander, not the most famous R&B singer, but the Beatles recorded several of his tunes. That's Anna, Go to Him. It was first released in 1962, and the Beatles then did their own version, as the Stones liked him as well. Then there's also Chains, a short lived addition to their live set. Chains was George Harrison's first outing on record as lead vocalist, written by the Brill Building husband and wife partnership of Jerry Goffin and Carole King. Chains was a 1962 single for The Cookies, one of the number of U.S. girl groups covered by the Beatles. And so, if you're interested in what number of artists were recorded, there were numerous girl groups and also all kinds of R&B bands. So that was one, was the Cookies version of Chains. The Beatles wanted to record, and they recorded their own version. This was actually originally Little Eva's backup singers, known from her biggest hit, The Locomotion, that was released in 1962 and reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. Then there's also Boys, also a girl group, the Shirelles in this case. Originally, when covering a song by a female artist, the gender would be switched. Not so when the gender is the song's title. Ringo also always used to do the song in the show, Paul later remembered. Back then, he had boys. It was a little embarrassing because it went, I'm talking about boys. Yeah, yeah, boys. It was a Shirelles hit, a girl group, and they were girls singing it. But we never thought we should call it girls just because Ringo was a boy. We just sang it the way they'd sung it and never considered any implications. So, also a hit for them, 1961 by the Shirelles. And then also the chart positions were pop #1, R&B #2 in the US, and pop #4 in the UK. And other versions come by other bands as well. Then, speaking of the Shirelles, girl groups and R&B groups predominated. Also, the Shirelles, "Baby, It's You." So the Shirelles provided two songs for the group's debut LP, "Please Please Me," with Ringo's Boys, followed by "Baby, It's You," which features an impassioned lead vocal from John Lennon. George Harrison's guitar solo was later overdubbed by producer George Martin, following him note for note on the release. So then we have A Taste of Honey. Paul took the lead on the Beatles cover of this. It was a standard. They also went back into their songbook and recorded a number of standards, and A Taste of Honey was one of them. It was one of their big numbers in Hamburg, a bit of a ballad. Paul reminisces it was different, but we used to get it requested a lot. We sang close harmonies on the little echo mics, and we made a fairly good job of it. It used to sound pretty good, actually. Oh, that's Paul's reflection. Taste of Honey had been around for a long time and then first recorded by Bobby Scott and his orchestra in 1960 with lyrics written by Rick Marlowe and Bobby Scott. The song became a moderate hit, reaching the top 20 on the Billboard charts. However, it was not until 1962 that the song gained widespread popularity when it was recorded by jazz singer Billy D. Williams, not to be confused with the actor. Williams's version of the song reached the top 10 in the Billboard charts and became a jazz standard. Since then, it's recorded by many other artists, including Herb Alpert, Ella Fitzgerald, Diana Krall, each putting their own unique spin on the classic tune. The LP cover reads, "Bobby Scott plays his original music for A Taste of Honey, produced on Broadway by David Merrick." The 1960 Broadway version, starring Angela Lansbury, of the 1958 British play was embellished by a musical score written by musician, songwriter, record producer Scott. He won a Grammy for composing The Taste of Honey and also co-wrote "He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother." That was, of course, by the Hollies with part of the British invasion. And he also had a vocal record hit in 1956 called "Chain Gang," not the famous Sam Cooke song. So tracks first appeared on Atlantic, "Taste of Honey" by Bobby Scott, October 1960. Bobby performed on piano, conducted the orchestra, and three separate tracks featured the famous theme and included at three different times. So first and third are slow string laden versions. The middle track is a more jazzy medium tempo treatment, and the track appeared in 1960. Then, of course, one of those songs made a big impression on me. That was "Twist and Shout." And this is a cover version which often becomes the de facto definitive version of the song. If you think about "All Along the Watchtower" by Jimi Hendrix, actually written by Bob Dylan, or Mr. Daniel's favorite, "Respect" by Aretha Franklin.
Yes.
The song "Respect" was actually written by Otis Redding, but it was made famous by Aretha Franklin, who recorded a version of the song in 1967. Franklin's version of "Respect" became a major hit, reaching number one in the Billboard Hot 100 chart, becoming an anthem. So the Isley Brothers first recorded "Twist and Shout," but no cover excels the original more than the Beatles' 1963 recording of the Isley Brothers' "Twist and Shout." And why is it excel? Because it was characterized by John Lennon's throat shredding vocal. It never stops being remarkable. And John had told the story later on. They were recording all day. His voice was almost totally thrashed. And "Twist and Shout" is, of course, a twist and shout kind of number. And with that throat bothering him a bit, he just went for it. And there's the Beatles, "Twist and Shout." They recorded after a long day of straining
Yes,
his voice. And the
indeed.
Beatles, of course, something about the Beatles, they went all over the place finding inspiration. There's a song from a 1958 musical, "The Music Man," "Till There Was You." That endeared itself to Paul McCartney thanks to Peggy Lee's Latin tinge version from her 1960 album, "Latin a la Lee." It became a staple of their live show. And of course, there's this incident where Paul cheekily introducing yet the Royal Command performance, and that was for the Queen. And before the Queen, they said, "This is from our favorite American group, Sophie Tucker," which got a good laugh. And of course, that's part of the Beatles' wit and humor, even before the Queen. So they were often very entertaining, to
Yes.
say the least. And then another uh, Girl group, Please Mr. Postman, which was not hard to listen to this particular song and imagine the excitement of seeing the fledgling Beatles in the Cavern Club one hot and sweaty lunchtime, because that's actually when they played during lunch. This high energy cover of the Marvelettes' 1961 single, the first Motown single to top the Billboard Hot 100, sees John's double track lead vocal trade call and response with Paul and George over a breathtaking 2.5 minutes that arguably improves upon the original. It's always best to listen to both and let fans decide, or just enjoy both. So Please Mr. Postman by the Marvelettes and the Beatles version. Then, of course, another artist they recorded numerous times. Where's the first one to mention? This is Rollover by Beethoven by, of course, the famous Chuck Berry. So all the Beatles love Chuck Berry, who did the original song. And John Lennon's got a very famous remark about this because he once remarked, quote, if you tried to give rock and roll another name, you might call it Chuck Berry. That recording features George Harrison on double track lead vocals. So Chuck Berry and then of course the Beatles. Then there is, speaking of Motown R&B again, You Really Got a Hold on Me. This is a marvelous cover of the Smokey Robinson The Miracles hit. Personal aside, and then many, many years later, and actually just several years ago, I actually interviewed The Miracles. So it was a big thrill
Yes.
for me because this is one of the songs that they are known for. But You Really Got a Hold on Me. In the sleeve notes for With the Beatles, Tony Barrow wrote that the boys have an immense admiration for America's rhythmic group, The Miracles. Continuing, John and George tackle the wild, relentless vocal with Paul joining them for the chorus. Producer George Martin joins in on piano, which he commonly did. He was, of course, a classical composer, but also really instrumental for arranging, particularly the early Beatles records. And there's Devil in Her Heart. The competition between Liverpool beat groups for new material was intense. Each band would do their best to seek out increasingly obscure records to cover. And George's Devil in Her Heart, originally by the Michigan girl group, again a girl group, the Donnays, was obscure as any that they ever recorded. The classic girl group call and response style fitted perfectly on their second long player with the Beatles. So originally a hit for them, and then also for the Beatles. And some other bands recorded it as well. They recorded it, the Beatles themselves, on the BBC. Then another one, it's one of those R&B classics that they recorded, Money. That's What I Want. Please Please Me, the
Yes.
LP, signed off with the raucous, as I mentioned earlier, Twist and Shout. So what could they do but close their second album in similar fashion? The answer came courtesy of Barrett Strong's 1959 Tamla single, Money, That's What I Want. John's searing vocal highlights why he is, for many, the ultimate rock and roll singer of all time. And of course, all the songs that were recorded that they loved, another name for rock and roll, that would be Chuck Berry. So they also recorded his rock and roll music. Few songs would last as long in the Beatles stage set as the Chuck Berry song here. It was first introduced as far back as 1960 at least and played countless times at the Cavern Club in Hamburg, had the distinction of opening the show at their last ever full concert. That's at Candlestick Park, San Francisco, in August of 1966. Then also some of those obscure songs, as always, Mr. Moonlight. Piano Red was a blues piano player who had worked with the likes of Blind Willie McTell. And in the early 1960s, he restyled himself as Dr. Feelgood. And it was the B side of his 1962 single that the Beatles recorded for their Beatles for Sale album the following year. An alternate take on Anthology 1 demonstrates the challenge of the opening wail. As John misses the note, Paul comments encouragingly, nearly. So it's also part of their wit and humor. It's like, okay, John, you almost did the same as Dr. Feelgood. So Mr. Moonlight, one of those obscure tracks, but they also made a cover version. Then one of the other individuals that they recorded a number of songs by, and that's Little Richard. So Kansas City, hey, 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 hey. So another little personal sideline on Kansas City. One time when I was in Kansas City, that famous lyrics in there on 12th Street and Vine. So when I was in Kansas City, I had to go to 12th Street and Vine. I want to know what was there because that's in the lyrics. And actually, what's there is not a whole lot. At one time, this was the hot center in Kansas City for the jazz clubs, and that's where that 12th Street and Vine reference comes to. But today, there's not a whole lot there. In any case, night in 2018, Paul recorded the session for this Little Richard cover. I remember John saying to me, "How do you do that? How do you do that?" I said, "I don't know. I feel like it just comes out the top of my head." He continued, and then we had a session once, and I'm about to do Kansas City. So I'm on the mic and I'm going to go Kansas, and he coughs, and I'm not making it. I'm not making it at all. So John comes down and he says, "Remember, it comes out of your head." I said, "Okay, Kansas City." And that's the take that you hear. So in the studio, we got a little bit of background and what they are actually doing off the scene, off the visual scene. Words of Love. This is one of the songs they recorded by another one of their early rock and roll favorites, the 1957 single by Buddy Holly, one of the biggest influences on John and Paul as songwriters. Wonder what Buddy Holly would have come up with. Of course, he died tragically in 1959 when his plane went down in over Clear Lake, Iowa, and also the Big Bopper and Richie Valens were killed at the same time. But Paul told Mojo, a famous magazine, the big attraction with Buddy was that he wrote his own stuff, which of course that's what the Beatles are known for. Buddy seemed to write all his own stuff, and it was those three chords. For people looking at this idea of writing our own stuff, which we were starting to do, the three-chord idea was great because we didn't know more than four or five. So big influence of writing his own songs and a real innovator, Buddy Holly, which of course the Beatles then took to the limit. And there is Honey Don't, which was another one of their big favorites, person that they like to record covers of. And this is, of course, the infamous Carl Perkins, who really was a rockabilly artist of the first rate. The soundtrack to the first movie, A Hard Day's Night, the first Fab Four LP to feature entirely self penned numbers, 1964's Beatles for Sale album returned to the formula of mixing Lennon McCartney songs with live favorites. John had sung this Carl Perkins cover since they first brought it into their set in 1962, but Ringo took ownership of it during sessions for the album. Honey Don't is a song written by Carl Perkins, originally released in 1956 as the B-side of another famous hit, Blue Suede Shoes. Both songs became rockabilly classics. Bill Dahl of AllMusic praised the song, saying, "Honey Don't actually outclasses its more celebrated platter mate in some ways. It's been covered by more than 20 other artists, including the Beatles, Ronnie Hawkins, and Johnny Rivers. The songs appeared in the films Prince of Tides, Diner, and Perfect Sisters." Then there is Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. George Harrison was such an admirer of American rockabilly singer, such as the Carl Perkins, that when the early Beatles adopted stage names for their first tour backing singer Johnny Gentle on a brief tour around Scotland in 1960, George became Carl Harrison. The original version of the song is by Rex Griffin. Finally, the two guitar heroes would eventually play the song together on a 1985 TV special. So, recorded in 1956, not released until 1957, dance album of Carl Perkins and credited to Carl as composer. It was his adaptation of the 1934 song written and recorded originally by Griffin. So, all through the years, Beatles continued to record Carl Perkins songs. Then another country artist that they liked, Act Naturally, the only cover version in the 1960s Beatle catalog not to have been previously part of their live act. Act Naturally was take on the 1963 Buck Owens number sung by Ringo on their 1965 Help LP. In 1989, Starr and Owens got together to record a new version of the song accompanied by an entertaining Western video. So when the Beatles like somebody, they continued to like them all throughout their career. There's Dizzy Miss Lizzy, best known for his 1957 hit Boney Maroney. Larry Williams provided three songs to be covered by the Beatles, all sung by John Lennon. According to biographer Mark Levinson, The Beatles, first as the Quarrymen, regularly performed the song from 1957 until 1961 with John Lennon on lead vocal, but there is no known recorded. Lennon himself recorded it for his 1975 album, Rock and Roll. Roy Young, again, personal note here to mention, Roy Young was also a collaborator of Ian Hunter. He recorded a single version of 1972, liner notes CD, Roy Young, the best of 50 years, another British musician who went to Germany to record. For this closer to the Help album, Lennon's trademark raucous delivery was in stark contrast to the preceding song, Paul's Bad Yesterday. George's stinging lead guitar work keeps the track at a frenzied level. So we also then have another Little Richard song that I like to record and cover out. The 1957 Little Richard song, Long Tall Sally, was a staple of the Beatles' live set from the very earliest formative years until they stopped touring in 1966. Indeed, it was the last song they played at their final full concert at San Francisco's Candlestick Park in August 1966. When Paul and John first met back in the summer of 1957, Long Tall Sally was among the songs Paul played to John, after which John invited him to join his band. That's really how the Beatles got going. As Paul told Playboy in 1984, I knew the words to 25 rock songs, so I got in the group. Long Tall Sally and Tutti Frutti, also by Little Richard, of course, that got me in. That was my audition, and that was the beginning of Lennon and me. There's Slow Down, recorded during the same sessions as the soundtrack to A Hard Day's Night. The Long Tall Sally EP featured John's I Call Your Name alongside three covers, Long Tall Sally, Matchbox, and the Larry Williams number by, of course, John again. Ted King Size Taylor from a rival Liverpool group told Beatles historian Mark Lewinson how the Beatles came to watch his band and all sat in a row and took down one line each of all the songs we did. Dizzy Miss Lizzie, Slow Down, Money, all of those. And the next time we saw them playing, they were playing all our stuff. So they kind of borrowed a lot of things from some bands as
Yes.
well. Slow Down was a part of the Beatles' live repertoire from 1960 to 1962, and the group had stopped playing it by the time they revived it during the Hard Day's Night sessions. A version of Slow Down was recorded on 16 July 1963 at the BBC Paris Theatre, London. It was included live on the BBC and taped for the Pop Go the Beatles program. Carl Perkins again comes on to the fore with Matchbox, and the Matchbox features Ringo on vocal duties. Perkins himself was invited along to the session, although he remained strictly an observer. Carl came to the session, Ringo said in 1964, I felt very embarrassed. I did it just 2 days before I went into the hospital with tonsillitis. Please forgive my throat. Those are some of the background of what actually went on while these folks were recording.
So,
And
Mr.
there,
Mick,
yes,
how
sir.
how we do wrap up this episode for the covers of the great bands of all time.
Yeah, a couple of things to mention about it in closing, because here are some of the things we get to see. What are the formative Beatles like? So they apparently really liked R&B. So we usually don't think of them as an R&B band, but they certainly had more covers by R&B and blues-oriented artists than anybody would think. Then secondly, which might be surprising, is they also recorded a lot of girl groups. So if you look at some of the biggest influence on the Beatles themselves, I'd have to say it was the pop hits by girl groups and also the R&B artists. So this is the irony of the Beatles, that they recorded all kinds of songs, even though they were probably the songwriters of all time and that greatest team, Lennon and McCartney. Instead, they had all kinds of covers. So especially early in their career, and then really later in their career with the Get Back sessions, they also had snippets of other songs as well. So here's something to say and wonder about the Beatles. Why are the greatest songwriters of all time had so many covers? But indeed, they did. They had a lot of them. And that's what's really interesting about the Beatles, never to be outdone by others. And if we look at the covers, it's a testament to their eclectic taste and dedication to the craft. Despite being one of the most influential and innovative bands in rock history, The Beatles never shied away from paying homage to their musical heroes and contemporaries. By recording cover versions of songs by R&B and rock and roll artists like Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, and the Drifters, the Beatles demonstrated their respect for the music that came before them and their willingness to learn from and build on the work of others. So, fascinating band, their own songs and cover versions, and we get to enjoy them all.
Certainly. Thank you so much for your legacy. And many of these greatest rock bands of all time have recorded numerous cover versions, paying tribute to their influences while reinterpreting classic songs in their own unique style. As Mr. Meek says, number one is the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, and Guns N' Roses. Thank you so much for your legacy to the world, and we are hoping that our generation will still cover your songs to the world. So, Mr. Meek, would you like to plug in something?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. So, the Doctor of Digital podcast and also as a book coach, that is the Idea to Author Coach on Facebook. Also, a couple volumes out there on Amazon, Burning America, and also on Track Ian Hunter. So, if you're interested, please check those out. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Mick because if you support him, more coaching to come, more books to come. And I want to plug in our new baby podcast, Mental Health 101, in its first season. People, Health 101 is created to empower, of course, our mental health. So, Mr. Mick, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel. Until next time, Deus Volt.
More to come, people. See you soon.